Hello everyone, how are you doing? We are still in the month of May where we celebrate Asian Heritage Month. In this video, we are going to interview Ming Quan. He is a member of South Arm United Church. He's going to tell us his story growing up in Victoria.
Hi there, it's Richard Ming Quan, born January 6, 1948 at the Royal Jubilee Hospital in Victoria. In fact, both my parents were born in BC also. I'm the oldest of five children, and I lived on Pandora Street in Victoria to begin with, and went to Spring Ridge Elementary and George J. Elementary. And then in fact, my wife, Linda, was in the same kindergarten class as me at Spring Ridge, but I didn't really know her. I think I was the only Chinese kid in that class because I got to hold that blackboard that showed what division and what grade you were. Actually, I did that for quite a few years because many times I was the only Chinese kid in the class. Many years later, I found out that when I started grade 3 at Cordova Bay, some of my friends who I met decades later said that the day I started there, the principal told me to go to his office for some reason, and then he stayed behind. And what that was all about was he told the kids in the class, who were all Caucasian, that today we have a new student, Chinese, and I want you all to pay particular attention on how you treat Ming, and etc., and threaten them too, naturally, if they did anything. So I didn't realize that until decades later, told by some of the students who were left behind. I remember many times people would ask me, "Do you speak Chinese?" And I says, "No," even though my parents sent me to Chinese school for a few years and even spent money tutoring me for a few years. But I didn't want to speak Chinese, even though my parents could speak English and Chinese, and my grandmother, who lived on the farm, spoke mostly Chinese. I didn't want to speak Chinese because otherwise, if I had an accent, the kids at school would tease me, because I saw them teasing kids who had a European accent or some other kind of accent, you know. So I didn't want to be teased. So I spoke English all the time, even to my parents and my grandmother, who spoke mostly Chinese, but she understood English. So anyways, I grew up that way, thinking myself not as Chinese, but as a Canadian. And then I went to university at UVic, and there were more Chinese, but not that many. And while I was going to university, in '68, my mom got me a job on BC Ferries. And that was because BC Ferries only at that time allowed male Chinese to work in the kitchen, you know, and so I was lucky in that sense, because there was very few Chinese of my age in your university who were eligible to work on BC Ferries. So in fact, in '68, it was when the time I met my wife, who's Caucasian, through a Chinese girl who I knew, who wasn't my girlfriend, but we knew them through our family. So I remember my parents saying, "It's okay to have a white girlfriend." and so what do you call that was very gratifying, because I never even thought of that, you know. But what do you call it? So I had their blessing. I went to work for the federal government in Ashcroft and Kamloops, and sometimes I think back, boy, I got this great job with the federal government with thousands of people they could have hired, and I was thinking, why would they hire me? And maybe it was because I was Chinese, because there were very few Chinese people hired in the federal government at that time. So again, I say to myself, maybe that was an advantage to being Chinese, even though I didn't speak Chinese. And anyways, I worked for the federal government for about 19 years. Then they closed down that department. Then I was out of a job, went to work for different companies, and one was a life insurance company, and that was one of the first questions they asked was, "Do you speak Chinese?" I says, "No." "But you look Chinese." I said, "Yes, I'm Chinese." And they said, "Oh, okay, fine." But because actually it was through a friend of ours at the church that got me that job. He said, "Oh, okay, we'll try you." So I worked there a couple of years, and then after that I went to work for some other companies, and all the time, I never thought of it, but I thought maybe afterwards, maybe they hired me because I was Chinese, and because I was Chinese, I'd bring in Chinese business, you see. So I worked at quite a few places: forklift places, auto repair shops, bowling alleys, etc. And many of the jobs were front counter jobs where I was very visible, so you're having a visible person. I finally got a job once we moved down to Vancouver, with the city of Richmond in 2003. And it wasn't exactly a job that I'd gone to school for, etc., but it was a job that was available, and I took it. It was janitor for the city of Richmond. So whenever I went out to eat at a Chinese restaurant, because there's a lot of Chinese restaurants here, and I love eating Chinese food, and my wife actually is even more desirable of eating Chinese food, and actually uses chopsticks when I go to a Chinese restaurant, ask for a fork, and they look at me strange. And then naturally, when I go to a Chinese restaurant, they start talking to me in Chinese, and I have to say to them, I don't speak Chinese. And sometimes I'll say to them in Chinese that I don't speak Chinese in Chinese. And then they really look at me like I'm trying to, fool around with them, kid them along, or joke with them. I says, "No, I really don't speak Chinese. I was born here." So then they usually give you a stare and then walk away, and then they come back and give you a fork, you see. And then sometimes somebody else comes back with a fork and they give it to my wife, but she says, "No, it's for my husband. I want a chopstick," you see. So it's a constant joke, especially when you go out with new friends that aren't used to this. So that's okay. Now, with Richmond, with the population becoming mostly Chinese, many times they'll want a Chinese person at their front counter. But I've never been able to get one of those jobs because I don't speak Chinese. They always ask me. So I've stayed at that job as a janitor because I don't have to speak Chinese. But if I spoke Chinese right away, I'd be at the front counter. Of course, they ask me the same question: "Do you speak Chinese?" I say, "No, but I look Chinese." But they say, "That's not good enough," because they'll be asking you questions in Chinese. They'll expect you to answer in Chinese. Many times you go to a restaurant, I'll talk to them in English, and then somewhere along the line they say, "Do you speak Chinese? Because we have somebody over there that has some questions." And I said, "No, I don't speak Chinese." And that happens in stores too, where someone's asking a question in Chinese, they don't speak English, they come over to me and ask me, "Oh, can you interpret for this person?" I says, "No, I don't speak Chinese." And I've met a lot of people in Richmond actually that are Chinese that don't speak Chinese. So I am not just one in many. And there's actually a word that describes people that are Chinese, that don't speak Chinese, that look Chinese but don't speak Chinese, and they're called bananas. And that's because they're yellow on the outside and white on the inside. So I guess some people might think that's a nasty thing to say, but it sort of describes that kind of person. In closing, being born here in a Canadian culture, and then having other cultures come here, I think I have a better understanding of how Canada's changing. We are a country of immigrants. In fact, my wife actually wanted to go and visit China, so we've been on 2 tours there. And I realize now that even though I don't talk Chinese and I don't sort of like do things Chinese people do, I see it, and when I was growing up I saw it too with my grandparents. That has molded me into the way I think and the way I behave. In fact, I appreciate the work ethic that the Chinese had. Growing up, it's made me think of work as more of, pardon me, a necessity to work, to do things. But in Canada here, in the decades that I have seen different immigrants come into Canada, they all have brought the good and the bad, and we have absorbed what we can use in Canada. And I think this is good for Canada because it makes Canada more accepting to welcome others, and it helps us grow and adapt to the changing world, because the world itself is always changing. So I think, when I think of myself, I don't think I'm Chinese Canadian. I'm a Canadian and Chinese by ethnicity, which many times you have to put down when you're doing a survey. I just did one recently. So I'm Canadian and my ethnic background is Chinese.
Well, thank you, Ming, for telling us your story. It is fascinating. I hope you enjoyed this video. There's so much to learn from one another.